it's a habitual thing, isn't it? Just sort of getting into
Yeah.
routines and stuff.
Right, I'm going to kick off the session actually because I noticed we've got 32 on, so that's a good number to start off with. So yes, welcome to the session, everybody. Very good to have you with us. So I'm David Orr. I'm one of the co-chairs for the Scottish Testing Group, and doing this kind of introductory session before we hand over to get the main speaker on of the evening, who will get introduced shortly. But tonight we're going to be talking about accessibility, inclusion, and raising our game above checklists. Okay, so in terms of the agenda, we're going to have a quick update in terms of what STG is, or what Scottish Testing Group is. I know there's a number of new people to the group that have joined tonight, so I'll give you a bit of an overview, a bit of a welcome, and then we'll move on to the introductions by our special guest host, Soumya Ramesh, presentations by Paul Alexander, and then we've got a panel discussion, including some audience interaction for around about 10 minutes, and then we'll move into the full Q&A. At that point, and Soumya will lead that for us. So Soumya will coordinate all of the Q&A you might have throughout the session. So please do feel free to add anything into the Q&A function or the chat function within Zoom. And then we'll do a final wrap up at the end. And we've got an announcement about our next event in that final segment. So do stay tuned to hear all about that one. And you can interact with us at Scottish Testing on Twitter if you wish to do so. Okay, so a little bit about the group. We were the first testing community in Scotland. We were set up around about 20 years ago, and we have been running very strongly up until 2018, and then we had a little bit of a hiatus at that point, up until the tail end of last year when we reignited ourselves with a number of virtual events. So we're really getting into the groove of this because this is our fourth one in about 10 weeks, having not run an event at all for two or so years. So yep, hopefully we can continue in this vein because it's a really good restart so far. So the original aim of the group was very much around promoting and sharing excellence in systems and software testing for the community of Scotland. And we do acknowledge that's an aim that we need to reevaluate at this point in time because of the way the market's moving. So that's something we'll look to adapt over the course of this year. And if you do have any feedback on the types of things you'd like the group to focus on, just do feel free to reach out. Normally what we would do in a year is have at least 2 half-day conferences with 3 or 4 speakers, full afternoon in either Glasgow or Edinburgh, normally in the kind of spring and autumn months. But obviously that hasn't been possible for the last year or so, but fingers crossed at some point in the not too distant future we may be able to resume those. But for now it's very much focused on the virtual events, and that's a good thing because what it's enabled us to do is we've had a number of other people coming to the sessions. So we've had speakers from all over Europe. We've had people from across the UK and other people from Europe and across the world joining some of the sessions as well, which has been really good to see. And that's been one of the big advantages of the virtual events. Okay, I'm going to stop us at that point and I'm going to hand over to Soumya. So I'll stop sharing my screen in a moment. Over to you, Soumya.
Thank you, David. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the talk on accessibility, inclusion, and raising our game about checklists by Paul Alexander. I'm Soumya Ramesh. I'm a consultant with 2i Testing, and I'll be managing the chat function for the talk today. So please feel free to post any questions on the Q&A feature of Zoom, as David was mentioning earlier. I would like to now give a brief introduction about our speaker, Paul Alexander. With a background in financial services, Paul's first testing role was with BNY Mellon. From there, he went on to set up the QA department and offering at the digital agency Realize, now called Kincarta Connect. While at Kincarta, Paul led QA teams in Edinburgh and Manchester, working with many international brands on large-scale websites, platform builds, maintenance, and campaign work. Paul also introduced QA as a third-party UAT and consultancy service. He's now working as a QA manager for the fantastic team at X Design, building first-class web and app tools and experiences. He can be found on Twitter on the hash and the handle @mustbetonight. Paul, really delighted to have you with us today. And I must mention Accessibility is a topic very close to my heart. So thank you so much for joining us. I'll hand it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to give this talk. To the point that I'm a little bit nervous, so we'll try and get through that part and get into the meat of it. I'm really delighted to see this many people on. I didn't think that this many people would come to see this. So with that, I'll start sharing the presentation. Thank you. Right, can everybody see that? Is that okay? Yep, fantastic. Okay, so welcome. So tonight, what I want to talk about is accessibility, inclusive design, and as it says in the title, sort of raising our game above sort of checklists. For me, there is an element where we look at accessibility as a bit of a tick box exercise. It's become a little bit focused on making sure that we're hitting X, Y, and Z, rather than the focus that we should really be bringing, which is the people affected by these things. And I think we should refocus this and make it about the person as opposed to the guidelines. So, as I say, we'll start off by talking a bit about accessibility and inclusive design. The sort of origin, well, a wee bit of the history on it, and just sort of why it's important and why we want to make sure that we're taking them into account when we're building products and websites and web apps and things. We're also going to look at sort of taking a people first approach to projects. This is not a silver bullet. It's not the approach that will fit everybody, but I've put together sort of a few ideas on how we would shape a team for inclusion. And then as testers, what we're interested in, how does that affect us for testing? So I'm going to sort of touch on how we can use things from inclusive design and accessibility in exploratory testing, because we're quite good, as I say, of taking the guidelines and going through our test scripts and going through our checklists and things like that. But sometimes we could enhance what we're doing by introducing into our exploratory testing. So we're going to have a look at that as well. So why is accessibility and inclusive design so important? The first thing I want to bring up is this. So in the United Nations Convention on Human Rights for People with Disabilities, access to information and communications technologies, including the web, is defined as a basic human right. So when we are looking at what we build, we should be making sure as many people as possible can use our products and use them well. We want them to be intuitive, we want them to be usable, and not just for the people who, you know, are in a privileged position that can use them as an able-bodied person. There's a theme that emerges through society, and the first time that I encountered anyway in part of my research was the British government commissioned a report back in 1971, and there was the inverse care law was muted, and thereby Julian Tudor Hart. So it's the principle that good medical or social care tends to vary inversely with the needs of the population. So the people who need it the most get the least, and the people who are able to, you know, who maybe have better lifestyles and things like that, were getting the better healthcare that didn't necessarily need it. And there's a really good quote that sort of paraphrases that, and it's to the extent that healthcare becomes a commodity, it becomes distributed just like champagne. That is, the rich get lots of it and the poor don't get any of it. So as humans, we do tend to repeat our mistakes, and that is reflected in how we approach digital solutions at times. You look at, we put a lot of effort and a lot of time into making things innovative and shiny, but the reality of it is that the people who would benefit most from that effort quite often get neglected. And as I said earlier, I do feel that sometimes when we focus on the checklist, we sort of dehumanize it a bit, and we make it a bit more about hitting a guideline. We don't really think about the person that's involved, and we should really be taking that into consideration when we're looking at our testing. Oh, skipped ahead by mistake there, apologies. So There's another quote that I want to bring up before we go on a bit, and that's the power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone regardless of disability is an essential aspect. So that's from Tim Berners-Lee, who essentially invented the World Wide Web as we know it. So there's sort of a misconception that accessibility and inclusive design are a new thing, that they're a new frontier that we're starting to get used to and things like that. But the first web accessibility guidelines were actually published back in January 1995. There was 14 guidelines in that. They still ring true today, but the thing with it is that as technology advances, you need to evolve with that. So further guidelines have come in. So with apologies. So with that, we've had the WCAG 2.0, which the first draft actually started back in 2001, but it didn't come in until 2008. So you can see the gap between us getting these things in, and then 10 years later we got 2.1, and 2.2 is in its draft just now. But what I want to take us back to is I want to take us back to the actual word accessible, and bring it back to the root of what it actually means. And the dictionary defines it as easy to approach, reach, enter, speak with, or use. And that's what we should be looking at when we're looking at accessibility. If we're going to drill it down, let's get back to the root of it, and let's make sure that we're looking at this from that perspective. A good friend of mine, and I believe he's actually on the call, once said to me, and I'm going to quickly look over here so I get this right, that the web is 100% accessible from its inception. It's our decisions that break it. The internet is built to be inclusive. It's built to be accessible. Everything we need to make it such is there. The decisions we make are the things that then stop us from actually producing accessible and usable content. We decide not to set up our designs in a specific way. We decide not to set up our code in a specific way. And sometimes we decide not to test in a specific way. We should be resetting that. We should be setting it that this is that there's the user focus, and we're starting from 100% and working backwards. You quite often get the question, can we ever be 100% accessible? It's debatable, but realistically, from a technical standpoint, yes, we can. So when we get back into what accessibility is, it relies on interrelated components to support each other. So that's web content. So whether that be text, images, forms, multimedia, scripts, applications, and things like that. User agents. So that's your what you use to access the content. So that'll be browsers, whether it be on your computer, on your phone, whether it's an app, a multimedia player, a plugin, whatever it might be. Authoring tools. So that's your code editors, your CMSs, and all these sorts of bits and pieces that help service that up to your medium, and adaptive strategies. So techniques that might help people with disabilities to use things. So if you look at, say, the Scottish Government website, they have in their header the ability to change the font size or to change the color contrast and things like that. That would be an example of an adaptive strategy on a website. So we then start to look at inclusivity. So again, I want to bring it back to the root. We've got the practice or policy of including people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized, such as those who have a physical or mental disability and members of minority groups. You might think that that's just an expansion on accessibility, but realistically, the two of them complement each other so well. Accessibility is more about attributes. It's more about making sure that we've got these things in place to make it as accessible as possible. Inclusive design looks at the usability of it, and if you apply inclusive design principles within there, accessibility tends to come in as a byproduct. So if you look at a lot of designs through history, inclusive design is at the core of all great design. Looking at people first and then taking things through rather than looking at how we might profit from it. So sort of the definition of inclusive design is a methodology that attempts to enable everybody, regardless of their situation, to participate. So what we need to do is we need to understand what could prevent people from participating. in both the physical and digital world to make better products. It's about identifying mismatches and interactions and finding solutions for those. Good examples within the physical world that are that will be obvious when you look at them, but aren't necessarily going to jump out at you, would be shampoo bottles. So if everybody on this call, I'm going to presume, will have shampoo bottles of some sort in their bathroom. If you look at any of the major brands, Head and Shoulders, L'Oreal, or anybody like that, look at your shampoo bottle and look at a bottle of conditioner. They're both different shapes. Shampoo has the lid on the top, conditioner has it on the bottom. That is deliberate. It doesn't make any difference to an able-bodied person realistically, and they won't even notice. But the underlying reason for that is that if you are, for example, somebody who's blind and can't see, if you're in the shower and you need to tell which one is which, you'll be able to tell by the shape of the bottle. What that also wonderfully leads into is, with inclusive design, we talk about permanent disabilities, temporary disabilities, and situational disabilities, or impairments, sorry. And if you look at the example of the shampoo and conditioner, for a permanent disability, you're blind, you can't see, you need to identify which one is which. In the example of, say, my wife, who recently had laser eye surgery, previously she had to take her glasses off to go in the shower, but without her glasses she could barely see. So for her, that's a temporary situation. When she puts her glasses on, she can see. When she takes them off, she can't. So she needs those. The other example I would use is that if you've got a child, or let's be honest, some adults as well, that don't want to get water in their eyes, or they'll close their eyes to protect themselves from that. So when they're reaching for that, they know they're getting the shampoo, they know they're getting the conditioner. So as I say, it's a small change in the design, but what it does is it allows for somebody with disabilities to use that product, and it makes little to no impact on general populace that be using it. Another example might be ramps. Everybody's seen them at the supermarket, they've seen them at the outside job centres, they'll see them at the chemists. Realistically, we're going to walk up the ramp. Not many of us are going to go diving up the stairs. There's quite a lot of people that will take that option. And again, with ramps, it could be for somebody in a wheelchair, that's the permanent. It could be somebody who is on crutches, that's a temporary situation, if it's a broken leg or something like that. Or it could be that you're at an airport and you're pulling a bag. You know, you might not you've got a heavy bag, you don't want to pull it up that set of stairs, so you're going to use the ramp. It's just an easier way of doing things. So with that, touching on that point, I'll sort of talk about the 3 principles of inclusive design. So it's about recognizing exclusion. So I've already sort of mentioned it's about identifying mismatches, that these can be physical, they can be cognitive, and they can be social. So what we should always remember in these things, especially when we're looking in the digital world, is that it's not just physical disabilities that we need to be catering for. We need to be mindful of cognitive impairments and social impairments as well, because if you only design your apps for a high-end phone on the latest operating system, you're excluding people who don't have those technologies. Now that could be people from a certain wealth category. They wouldn't be able to use this product or service. You could be excluding older people that are more accustomed to certain ways of doing things, and they want to use that technology. So you've got to make sure that we're taking those things into consideration when we're recognizing exclusion. It's not just about the physical disabilities you can see, it's about the underlying mismatches and interactions that you would need to take into consideration. The second principle is that we've got to learn from diversity. So we've got to look at these mismatches with empathy, spend time to understand the experience from that person's perspective. You'll see some people who will sort of put on a blindfold and try and use a screen reader and stuff like that. Realistically, that's not going to give you that person's experience. That's going to go some way to highlighting what makes things difficult. But realistically, what you need to do is you need to go and either experience or speak to people about these things and how it affects them. If you aren't confident enough to speak to people, Twitter is absolutely awash with people who will highlight these mismatches for you. They will tell you where they're struggling with things. They will highlight products that are good experiences. They'll highlight things that are bad experiences. You just have to have a quick look. And the third one is solve for one, extend to many. So I touched on it there about permanent, temporary, and situational. Often if you fix something on from a permanent issue, it's likely to have a far-reaching result beyond that audience. It's often referred to as the persona spectrum, and it's sort of expanding out from the root problem to then helping other people. So why do we want to do this? We have a term in the industry called the purple pound. Now that is the term that refers to the 274 billion spending power. Now this was estimated last year before COVID and all that sort of stuff. So we can't, it might not be exactly right just now, but that's the spending power of disabled households across the UK. So 1 in 5 potential consumers in the UK have some form of disability. 3/4 of them experience significant barriers of a quarter of their everyday websites, causing them to find alternatives or to give up entirely. With the current pandemic, that number is probably larger, but the thing is for me is that it's even more important. The web in the last year has become where we socialize. It's become where we work. It's become where we shop. We don't rely on physical locations at the moment to do these things. We're reliant on the web. We're reliant on webs. We're reliant on apps. We need these experiences to work for everybody. Otherwise, this is even harder for the people who are in those positions. We're all struggling with with what's going on, and what we need to remember is that everybody else is struggling as well, and we want to make sure that we're not putting up extra barriers to make this more difficult for them. I think by doing that, we're not meeting our own responsibilities. So the examples we've got up here, now these have been taken from Microsoft's inclusive design toolkit. So there's a few examples of the different types that are here. So we have touch, and as I sort of we were talking about earlier, we have permanent, temporary, and situational. So I'll quickly walk through these. I'm not going to dwell on them too much, but touch, we have from a permanent standpoint, we have a person with one arm. So if I'm developing a mobile app, I want to make sure that I can do everything with one hand. I don't want to have to turn the phone to get a different viewport. I don't want to have to stretch too far up the screen because I might lose my balance of my phone and drop it. I want to make sure everything's in touchable reach and I can scroll it. Now, by solving a problem for somebody with one arm and making sure they can use it, you then fix that for somebody who has an arm injury. So if you've broken your collarbone or you've broken your hand and you're in a sling, you're not going to have that extra hand. Your hand's going to be here. You're going to have to do it there. The other thing as well is that it also solves it for a new parent. So if you're trying to cradle a baby and do this, that's a situational issue. You could apply it to, say, you're in the airport as well, and you're trying to bring up your online tickets on your app. Quite often you've got a bag, or if you've got a child, you can't be fiddling about these things, because then you stop, you put it down, you get in people's way, it causes you anxiety, it causes other people anxiety. You just want to be able to do it nice and easy. So by fixing that for a person with one arm, you then fix it for the person who's got a broken arm, you fix it for the person who's stressed out trying to get through the airport with a child. It's about focusing it on how we can expand that out. The next example on this slide is see. So you could be blind. So if you fix something for somebody who's blind, you would also fix it for somebody who has a cataract. So that can be treated and it can be fixed, so it could be classed as a temporary impairment. And then the situation will be a distracted driver. How many times will we look around, when we're driving the car, or I'll get caught by something, or somebody will be talking to us and we'll turn, or to use the example of the kids, they're kicking off in the back of the car, so you've got to look over your shoulder and tell them you're going to pull the car over if they don't quit it. It happens. So if you can solve the problem for somebody who's blind, that then extends through to the people who have these other impairments. There's two more that they use as an example, and I like these ones. So there's here. So if you fix something for somebody who's deaf, you also fix it for somebody who has an ear infection, but you also fix it for somebody like a bartender, somebody who's in a busy environment with lots of background noise. They need to pick something out. A good example of this, well, sort of relative to this, is polyphonic ringtones. So a lot of people bought into them, and you could download them years ago, that you would pick a fancy tune that you liked or whatever for your mobile phone. My mother's high tone deaf, so without those polyphonic ringtones, she wouldn't be able to hear her mobile. I remember when we were in my teens and stuff like that, we would sit and go through all the ringtones until we found one that my mum could hear, because it's not about that full deafness. She could only hear certain pitches. So by bringing in polyphonic ringtones, if you brought it into this situation, you could have it for, say, my mother, so that she could hear her phone. You could have it if somebody's got an ear infection. It might be that only really high pitched tones is setting them off, or they had a perforated eardrum, or a migraine. Let's be honest, whenever we've got a headache, something that's too high pitch is just going to make it worse. And then if you're on a train, or as it says, a bartender or something like that, with these different ringtones, you can pick that out from the crowd noise, because it does have that little bit of variety. So while for a lot of us, it might be a bit of novelty and things like that, the root of that was to help people, and we bring that through. And the last one that we've got on here is speak. So there's, for people who are non-verbal, you would then, if you solve it for them, you solve it for people with laryngitis. You solve it for those people who maybe, have lost their voice through something. You could then sort it out for somebody with a heavy accent, somebody who struggles to communicate. You solve it for them in a situation, because it might be that it's not their native tongue and they're struggling to interact with people. If you can take away the need for that by coming up with a solution for a non-verbal person, it expands through there. So that is, that's why we would look at that. One thing I want to touch on is actually something that happened in the last 24 hours. So as most of us, I'm sure everybody will be aware, there's a new president in the White House, and there's been a few changes in the last 24 hours, a few executive orders signed and all this sort of stuff. There have been two things done on the White House website in the last 24 hours that I think are excellent. And the first one is that, and I've written this down, so that's why I'm staring off to the side. So yesterday, embedded in the code, they've actually put, if you're reading this, we need your help. We need your help building back better. So they've actually embedded in the code, trying to recruit developers who are playing about in the code to come and make things better. They've hidden that little Easter egg in there, but I think it also pulls through in other areas as well. But the one that really caught my eye was in the contact us form. So what they've added is they've added a field, so you can select what pronoun you want to be referred to as. So it could be he, him, she, her, but they've also put they, them. They've got other, and they've got that you don't want to disclose. And we were talking earlier on about societal differences and things like that. We need to make sure that we're mindful of our copy and our imagery. If you are, for example, transgender, we look at this as a thing. If you're transgender, gendered language in a website that might not be necessary could be alienating for you. So if you're applying for a job and there's a lot of sort of talking about he and she and everything like that, that might put you off working in that environment. It could make you feel slightly alienated when you read all these things. So where possible, we should be looking to make sure our language is appropriate. Obviously, we're not going to, if we're talking about male and female and things like that, we will use the terminology. It's not that we should be changing it for change's sake, but it's more just when we don't need to use that, we don't need to specify, we don't, you know, these things should be taken into account. It could also be that a word or a phrase in a foreign country, or a country non-native to where you're producing your content, it could mean something completely different. So you've just got to be careful that if your product is going to be reaching out to other cultures and things like that, that you are not either misappropriating culture, or that you are putting things out that just realistically are just going to cause people discomfort or upset. And I think that's something that we miss quite a lot. We'll look at our checklist for accessibility, and we'll go through it and say, do you know what? Got all my labels in place. I've got my tagging done. This is all looking great. It goes through the screen reader. We're not taking the person that's going to use this into account. We need to sort of take that step back and realize that there's a bigger picture. And if you can reach more people, then you can grow your business on the back of it as well. We talked about the purple pound earlier on, and I did a blog post a while back that basically said that I felt the need for the purple pound was a bit vulgar. I understand why we have it, and I understand that it's a really good tool for helping decision makers understand why we need to do this. You put it into pounds for them. It's kind of a little bit of inclusive design itself, realistically, because you're catering your approach to your audience. But realistically, if you aren't taking these things into account, you're going to miss out on a whole load of revenue and a broader user base. So with that, we're going to look at taking a people first approach to our projects. So whatever project we need to create, we need to start off by creating a sense of belonging within our team. For me, if your team isn't set up as to be inclusive with your team members, you're not going to be inclusive with your end users. So the sort of sense of belonging, I've found it described really well by somebody called Chris Burnett. I found it via the Turner Consulting Group, as it being a cross-section of inclusion, diversity, and equity. So it's sort of taking that together and making sure that we give people a sense of belonging. If people feel like they belong, whether that be in the physical, digital, social, they will use that medium. It's much like social interactions. If you give somebody a sense of belonging within a conversation, that conversation is going to be richer, it's going to last longer, and it's going to be a more fruitful conversation. So, as I say, we want to foster inclusion in our teams so that can bleed through into our products. We want to collate user data on our target users, because at the end of the day, we don't want to just go, right, here's a solution, this is our problem. What we need to do is we go, right, here's a problem, who does it affect? So let's go and look at who we're targeting. Let's look at our end users, and let's determine the qualities and differences and capabilities of those users. If we can get that information together, it will give us a far better footing to then build out whether it be our concepts, our designs, our technical implementation. Even when we're doing our test design, it gives us that anchor point to bring it back to. So from there, my sort of suggestion on there is that you want to look to figure out how you want to personify this. So you would want to agree a number of personas to create. You take that amount, you take the personas, you take a number of personas. You don't want to have too many, because then that will dilute the quality of your product and you won't be able to find a focus. But by the same token, too few, too narrow, and you're going to find so many exclusions when you try and push this live. So once you've agreed your personas, sorry, skip that ahead by mistake. We'll just leave it there just now. You want to sort of name and describe each persona, and you want to give it just one or two pages. You should always include a name and a picture. This is about making sure that this is a person. This isn't just the blind one. This isn't just the one with ADHD. This is Jerry that works in accounts. This is Samantha that works on reception. This is Jacob that works in design. You want to make sure that when you're looking at these personas, you're feeling the empathy for these people. If you do it based around the disability, it kind of, again, it defeats the purpose. It kind of dehumanizes it. So that's why we want to have these things there. So you want to put in things like the user's values. What are their interests? What's their education level? Whether it be a digital literacy or a linguistic literacy. What are their needs? What are their attitudes towards things? Will they give up easily? You put that into your persona, and that allows you to sort of understand who you're working with. What are their capabilities? What are their goals and behavior patterns? So what are they actually going to try and get out of this? Now, another thing I like to do with these things, in addition to that, is to sort of put in a bit more information to make you empathize with them. So whether that be that you write a small backstory to them, give somebody a little bit of an insight into that person's life. It's quite often better to write that as a story so that people can read it almost like a short paragraph from a book or something like that. If you put it into bullet points, people tend to skim through it and they won't really take it in properly. So try, where possible, to write that person's backstory. That way, again, we can look at the person as opposed to the disability, or as opposed to, you know, them being a tick box that we're wanting to fulfill. So what we want to do after we've got those personas is we want to look to describe and devise sort of situations, scenarios that will prompt your persona to engage with your product. It might be, you know, the purpose of your app is that you want to sell cinema tickets. So if you have a range of personas, what's going to get those people to trigger that? Is it that somebody who wants to go alone and go and see it? Do they want to find an accessible cinema? Do they want to go with friends? You've got to sort of look at the different scenarios that they're going to try and coordinate their trip and things like that. Once you've got those things together in combination with the personas, that is at the point where you start mapping out your designs and your technical solutions. Without those things, you can't start pulling those things together. For me, the use of personas gives everybody an anchor point, whether it be a designer, whether it be a copywriter, a product owner, a developer, a tester. We all need that place to anchor back to the purpose of what we're doing. So that's, you know, I think that the use of personas in this light will allow us all to be on the same page and give us that sort of steer back into the right direction. And one thing I will say as well is, don't be afraid to revisit the personas. If you discover that something's missing or something's not quite right, amend them, refine them, replace them if necessary. Just, you know, make sure you do it as a group. The whole thing about we said at the start, where we lay out that we want the team to be inclusive. You want everybody to be involved in these decisions because everybody's voice has equity. Everybody has something valuable to say. Everybody has an insight that you don't have. We all have different perspectives. We all have different experiences. And sometimes that's to our detriment because we'll have our biases. We'll go down things based on how we've done it before or our experience of this. So that must mean that. That's why if we have these other pairs of shoes to wear, so we can look through their eyes and we can sort of try and take it that way, it will give us a much rounder experience for our users. So, as I accidentally clicked ahead earlier, so what does that mean for us in testing? So for me, what we're looking at here is we're looking at an opportunity to be involved at the earliest point in the project. We want to be in the discussions when we're talking about personas. We want to be in the discussions when we're talking about design. The more knowledge we get, the better our testing will be, because we'll be able to direct things and we'll be able to understand the purpose of what we've got. It gives us an opportunity as well to put a quality mindset through the spine of the project. as agile as teams are getting, and as inclusive as digital agencies are putting themselves out there to be, the reality of the situation we know as testers is that we will quite often be late to the party. It's okay, test will get involved then. We want to be involved early. We want to get involved in all the discussions. We are interested, we are engaged, we have something to say. So if we take this approach and we're able to get our teams to take this approach on the projects, it allows us to have that. It allows us to have what we would want, but it also allows us to feed into the team from that perspective. I kind of touched on it a moment ago, but one of the other key things is that it exposes us to decisions that we might not have had involvement in before. We can understand why things have happened rather than coming with questions late in the process. You quite often find that we as a testing, as a group, QA, whatever we're sort of branding ourselves as, we are risk averse. We look at things and go, oh, risk, problem, that might go wrong. You know, it's the nature of what we do. And if we come to the party after the designs are done, after the technical implementation's already underway, and we start going, what's that? Why is that? And start pointing at things, we're too late. So I think what this, as I say, it gives us that involvement early, but it allows us to see why decisions were made. And if we're in, and we allows us to have a voice within that decision making process. We'll get onto this in a second, but it gives us a new driver for exploratory testing, taking this approach. Quite often with exploratory testing, we'll set our test charter, we'll time bound it and everything like that. But we don't really apply that to accessibility, in my experience anyway. Quite often, as I say, it's very script heavy, it's very checklist heavy. And I've used the word dehumanizing earlier in the talk. It kind of takes away the person from that experience. And that's why we want to take these personas and use them as a driver for exploratory testing. And one other thing before we move into the next part, it gives us a potential to use new tools and technologies. We're all involved in the businesses we're involved in because we like to see new things. You know, we like to play with new toys, and we like to have new ways of finding issues. Using things like Wave and Silktide and other sort of emulators and checkers and things like that, those are interesting. They pop up new things. You look at Wave, and Wave will flag any discrepancies, but they also flag all the supposed good bits as well. You still have to go through it. You have to understand why things are the way they are, because you get a lot of false positives and a lot of false negatives. It's about sort of taking your time and going through these. And I think having new tools and technology to play with gives us something interesting, rather than, again, going through that checklist and just ticking things off as we go. So when we come to the exploratory testing, we want to make this about the person, not the disability. So incorporate your personas in your test charter. I mentioned it earlier on, in the true sense of the dictionary definition of exploratory testing, we want to set a charter. So create shoes for them to wear, and it will let us test with that person in mind, rather than just compliance criteria, realistically. It's all very well that we want to make sure that this has got an alt tag and that it works with the screen reader and things like that. But what if you've got one of your personas has got Parkinson's? The buttons might not be sufficient for that person. You need to sort of take that into consideration and look at the different ways that we can approach it. So make it about that person, not about the criteria that you're trying to fulfill. Yes, the criteria is important. I am not going to tell you the checklist is dead. This is not a revolution against WCAG. It is completely necessary, and we do need these checklists, but we can supplement things and make much better products if we just look at it from the person's perspective. When you're looking to do your time boxing as well on your exploratory tests, think about that persona's abilities and capabilities. This might take people longer to do these journeys. Let's make sure that we're giving enough time when we're doing that to get through it. We can't base it on our abilities and our sort of capabilities, because at the end of the day, we're digital natives, most of us. We work on computers every day. We're going to whiz through things a lot faster than people with these disabilities. So when we're looking at the personas, We want to make sure that we're giving it that chance. And as I say here, the final statement on there is make this about the disability. Make this about the person, not the disability. Oh wow, that was a slip. Make sure that it's about the person, not about the disability. When we read about the persona, we want to know about the fact that Jacob loves painting at the weekends and he loves going out to watch the football, and his favorite way of interacting with the internet is via Twitter. He goes out with his dog, but he's also in a wheelchair. We want to add that in. That's the last thing we need to know about. We need to know about that person, and then the disability is just part of them. It's not what should define the persona. And thank you. Oh, how do I stop presenting?
Thank you very much, Paul. That was a very insightful talk, and I couldn't agree more. I think accessibility needs to be way beyond a big box to tick, and I've thought a lot on this topic because I've been working on the accessibility testing area as such for a while, and this is the big kind of, let's say, something that baffles me all the time, in that it's clear to see why accessibility is important. There's ethical reasons, there's commercial reasons, there's legal reasons, and yet when it comes to practice, it's shocking almost to see how low it kind of tends to get in the list of priority, or how limited the awareness is about it. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on why do we have that disconnect and the mismatch?
I think it's some people put it down to a lack of knowledge, or a lack of awareness. There's an element of a lack of empathy. It's quite often seen as an afterthought. It's not seen as something that should be embedded within practice. I think as a society we've changed in our attitudes, and that's probably why it's become a bit more prevalent. I think it's maybe been less of a there's been less of a focus in previous years due to that, but there has been a bit of a shift in mindset generally. So I think that's maybe why it's become a bit prevalent. But yeah, I think that sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a moment. I think that what we've got is we've got a more open and inclusive society that we're trying to foster, and within that, that's why it's becoming more prevalent now. I think that one thing that I've missed off there as well, that I think there's a bit of a misconception that it's this massive extra cost and overhead to make something accessible. But as I sort of talked about there, if you embed it in your process from the start and it runs as a vein through your project, it becomes muscle memory. I'm not going to say that the first couple of projects will go perfectly and that everything's just going to fall into place. It's like a magic wand. But with time and with practice, it doesn't have an extra cost to it. It just becomes the standard.
I wonder, from my perspective, whether it's got something to do with the development tools that are available. Because if we take it back to the fact that if you're in a development environment where the tools aren't set to think about accessibility and usability, then it's quite possible that the use of tools to rapidly develop and deploy software, if they're not trained to think around accessibility, it's just not helping in that way.
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the other things, you talk about the sort of rapid deployment and things like that, that is the thing, that's the taking that moment to think. It's not always about that. It's about just building something and getting it out as fast as you can. And then thinking that you can retrospectively just add that in later. We need to be first to market, so let's get it out there, and then we can look at it as a later consideration. And as test analysts, we've all seen that graph that starts here and curves up. It's talking about the amount of money it costs to fix problems the further you get on with them. And it's the same with accessibility. It's the same thing. If you deploy something to that.
It is one of the things that we have been talking about for years. I could pick off my bookshelf the book by Alan Cooper, The Inmates Are Running the Asylum, talking about usability design rather than usability testing. And if we extend that out from usability to be accessibility and inclusion, I can look it up now to find out how old that book is, but it's something that we have been talking about for decades, and yet it still doesn't seem to stick. It would be really nice if conversations like this help that message get out there and start to stick. So.
Indeed, and sometimes I wonder, it's also, I try to draw parallels of accessibility features with how perhaps the physical world adapted to making buildings accessible. That's my nearest best comparison. And I sometimes wonder the kind of turnaround time when lifts and ramps started to be planned as part of a default architecture for any building. It must have, that turnaround must have taken its own time, but it's kind of now more and more frequent and common, and it is seen as an essential thing. So maybe it's a part of the evolution that as humanity, as a society, we are kind of still evolving in the technology sphere. And strangely enough, the pandemic might have actually kind of steered us in that direction. We are, as Paul mentioned, it's kind of technology is pivotal to our lifestyles. And as we start to encounter more and more circumstances of some of our, the mainstream audience start to kind of see, okay, this is where the accessibility feature would actually help me as well. And you kind of start to think, it's not for the fringe, it's for everyone. And it's for your own self. And you think it's a faraway topic, it's nothing to do with me. And even if you think it was that distant, I think it starts to, when a technology kind of is so closely coupled with your lifestyle, you start to encounter those issues more and more, and you start to see how inevitable some of these features are. So maybe it's a point of that kind of evolution within technology as such, when we'll all kind of start to think about accessibility by default.
It's funny you mentioned buildings.
Well, interesting. I was just about to say something relating to buildings, because a topic close to my heart is that of electricals and electrical installations. And I don't know if you've noticed in new buildings, all of the power points are, I can't remember the exact figure, but they're something like 14 inches off the floor. Whereas it used to be that you put them right down at skirting board level. Now they're up a good few inches to make PowerPoints accessible by everybody from people in wheelchairs to older people. And as I've got older, I now don't have to bend down as far to plug something in. So the electrical regulations, if you're doing a new building, now include the positioning of electrical fittings. So, yep.
Yeah, and to double up on that, I think it's maybe in the last 10 years or so, all new build houses have to have a ground floor toilet. So similar to, you know, any new house that's coming in, traditionally if the, say, a 3-bedroom semi was getting built, you'd have a toilet at the top of the stairs and everything like that. But nowadays, what's in the building standards is, for similar reasons you say there's a toilet downstairs now in all of the new build houses, and able-bodied people are loving it because they don't have to go all the way up the stairs when they pause their TV show. They can just pop through and pop back. And yeah, it's, as you were saying there, Sue, that kind of cries back into the sort of permanent, temporary, and situational. If you put it the right way in terms of the electrical power points, or having a toilet on the ground floor and things like that, it works for everybody.
It's a really good set of points, and I really like the distinction there between permanent, temporary, and situational. So I'm going to actually give a little personal example, if that's okay. So my fiance has multiple sclerosis, and she's not overly affected by it at this point in terms of mobility, but she occasionally has to use a wheelchair. For example, one time we went to Silverburn Shopping Centre, so we've got a situational point here whereby we decided, because we're going to be out for a while, that it would be beneficial to use the wheelchair. So this was a very eye-opening experience for me, to see how challenging it is to just be able to move around the physical world. It was fine when we were in the main concourse of the shopping centre, but as soon as we went into a shop, we had difficulties trying to navigate around the shop. It was difficult to get through some of the aisles. It was difficult to get to some of the places that we wanted to be. So it was just very challenging, and it was really, really surprising. I mean, it's just things that I would never have noticed before I had that experience. So I think the key thing that made me learn, I suppose, was it's kind of tragic that we're still having such poor quality websites and poor quality applications in the virtual world, when we can much more control that than the physical world, which we have designed over hundreds of years, and it was never built with accessibility in mind. So we really do have a great opportunity to not do that in the virtual world, and it is, I think, very tragic that so many companies continue to make these mistakes. So I think very powerful talk, Paul, and yeah, I like that distinction, and it just made that example kind of fit nicely for me. So I thought I would share it before we move into the actual Q&A.
Thank you for sharing that, David.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, absolutely. I think I remember writing my first blog on accessibility around how becoming a mother made me realize how important lifts were. I don't know if I thought of them to be so essential, lifts and ramps, and actually the actual realization happened having a buggy around me, running late for an appointment, and to realize you have 12 steps to get through, before you get to the door. And you kind of start to think how much we get into the point of inevitability, and you kind of realize how helpless someone in that position must feel if that was how their life was predominantly. And you kind of start, a lot of things start to kind of seem very relatable. So yeah, absolutely. I think this is a topic, no matter how distant and far off it might seem to one, I think it's much closer than we think. I think there are a couple of questions which have come in through the Q&A function, and I'd like to bring them up if that's okay, Paul. I think this was with reference to how you mentioned about writing personas about the person and not about disability. So Stephen Lani is asking, are we saying that we should not have personas to specifically cater for the disabled community that might use the product?
No, sorry if that came across the wrong way. What I was more meaning there is that the persona should be about the person. We should definitely be talking about their capabilities and impairments within that persona, but that shouldn't be the focus. I think the problem we have a lot of the time is that we view things as the disability first, as opposed to the person first. So what I'm saying there with the persona is that we need to, well, it would be better to look at this as a person who has a disability as opposed to a disability persona, if that makes sense. So yes, we will include the disabilities within the persona, but it shouldn't be, it should be part of that person as opposed to what defines that person. I think that's the key thing to sort of take from that.
Thank you, Paul. There's another question from Fergus McAteer. Is there merit in testing alongside people with permanent impairments? It can be hard to fully envision the difficulties a person faces without living with them, which can reduce the efficacy of a persona.
100%. There is no substitute for people who have those impairments. In the ideal world, you would have a whole raft of people from various backgrounds and various abilities and various capabilities testing every product we produce. Unfortunately, that's just not something that we can cater for. But if we have the opportunity to work with people with disabilities and impairments when we're building our products, 100% we should embrace that and grab it with both hands. It's really something that we should be encouraging where we can.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, in fact, to add to that one, both Soumya and myself worked with a gentleman by the name of David Murdoch, and I will say that it's very interesting when the language comes out, when you're talking around certain subjects, how the language then almost becomes awkward, because he's severely visually impaired. But I will definitely say that he opened my eyes to all sorts of difficulties with products, with lighting, with all sorts of elements, and I'm eternally grateful to David for doing so.
Absolutely. I think I must say, I think David brought so much knowledge with him. And the one other thing I realized when David was working was because he was, he's a consultant in accessibility. So he's not just a consumer of accessible features, but he's somebody who assesses things for accessibility. And the way his approach and his perspective on everything made me think about both sides of technology, of putting somebody who has these challenges to be one of our colleagues, or things like intranet and a lot of tools that we use at work. They can be of such poor accessibility, in the way they render. You don't really notice it a lot of times, and some of these things, they're quite sensitive, and one might not to kind of talk about it openly. And you don't want to go around telling, oh, I have color blindness. It's one of these things. It's a fairly sensitive area. You might not really want to divulge, but you might be silently suffering through how poorly designed a particular tool is, or how kind of poorly designed the intranet website of a company is. It kind of made me kind of see that perspective more and more, and you start to think how often the kind of more visible disabilities are perhaps catered to, and the kind of not so visible disabilities are sometimes not attended to. And in the capacity of somebody being a consumer and as well as a producer of content, and being a contributor in a kind of a product development environment. Well, there's another question that's come through by Ravikala Krishnan. Are there any compliance? I guess there's a reference to perhaps some kind of guidelines that exist for accessibility, like GDPR. I don't know if it's compliance in terms of regulations or guidelines. I'm not sure, Ravikala, but I'll pose this question to Paul.
Well, in America, they have the ADA legislation, so that's the sort of Disabilities Act, where it's illegal to discriminate against someone for their disabilities. I know that there was a bus company that was sued because it didn't have the option to flag that you were a wheelchair user when you were booking a bus ticket, and the person turned up to get the bus, and lo and behold, it wasn't wheelchair accessible, so they couldn't take their journey. So they sued that bus company. So in America, there's the ADA legislation that covers discrimination as a whole, which would obviously extend to disability and things like that. And we have the Equalities Act that's come through here, and that's along a similar line. Making sure that we aren't discriminating against people based on anything, really. There shouldn't be any conscious discrimination when we're looking at putting things out to market and stuff like that.
Thank you, Paul. There's another question by Kevin Molinero. Sorry if I'm not got the name right. The question is, you talked about rushing things to market. Do you think an MVP isn't an MVP if the accessibility acceptance criteria haven't been defined and how do you help other disciplines write them effectively?
That's a very good question. I'm actually going to pull it up so that I've got it in front of me. So, yeah, I would say that you can't have an MVP if the accessibility acceptance criteria haven't been defined. It has to be part of the project, part of the process that this is included. MVP sort of standing for minimal viable product. It's not viable if it's not meeting the purpose of what you're trying to do, and the purpose of what you're trying to do is reach as many people as possible. And how do you help other disciplines write them effectively? I spoke about sort of creating inclusive teams and making sure that we give everybody's voice equity. We need to get people involved. We need to get the right people involved. It's not always the most senior person that is the best person to be involved. What you're looking for is people who are going to evangelize what you're talking about, people who are going to go and spread the word around their teams and help bring people on side with these things. Now, sometimes there is a little bit of dependent on the personalities of the people who are in certain positions. You do kind of need to pick your people right. But as I say, what I would say is pick your people and get them all involved. If they buy into it and they become invested in it, and I spoke about belonging in the talk, if you can make them feel that they belong within that process, they will then push it with their peers, and that should hopefully share that experience through and bring people on side.
Thank you, Paul. I think that's a brilliant point, and I think absolutely. I think MVP, the definition of it, I think it needs to be representative of a wide set of factors, and accessibility should be one of them. And I hope there's a conscious effort in making that happen across the industry. And on that topic, I wanted to ask you, Paul, what would be your kind of ideal set of, let's say, user stories or representation around accessibility? Would you say it should be driven by some kind of market research which says definitely cover these disabilities because this is what we are expecting, or go with a set of this is what we will expect general audience to have this kind of disabilities definitely in the demography, so we'll want to cater to them? What would your advice be on that persona coverage? What would you think would be the right thing to do? Is user research and kind of that you study on the target audience important, or should there be more of a generic definition to it?
I think that the term normal is a mathematical term that that doesn't apply to people, but we use it as a term for people. If you were to use it and use normal as a scale of 10, there's never going to be one person that will hit all 10. So you do need to take your market into consideration. You do need to take your potential user base into consideration. I would say that it's on a project by project basis. You can boilerplate your personas if you want to, but realistically, it's not going to really be as effective as if you look at the users you're expecting. Yes, there's going to be users that you don't expect. We're not going to exclude from them. We're going to try and make it as inclusive and as accessible as possible. But realistically, you do have to look past past a mass. I'm trying to put this without it, because obviously you don't want to create exclusions. So yes, I would look at my user market. I would look at it specifically on a product and project basis where we're going to go with these things. I don't think standardizing things helps. Again, we want to make this about the people. We also shouldn't rely on data alone, though. I will say that. I think that there is a bit of a new frontier with data intelligence where we're looking at analytics and we're pulling all these things in and stuff like that. And that's great. And it should work as a guide, but it shouldn't be the be all and end all. We should look at the people. So I would say probably a balance between the two. would be good. I don't know if that answers your question.
That was a very good kind of thought around that. Thank you, Paul. I think this is something I struggle to kind of sometimes provide as a recommendation. I would go with what you said, where it's a bit tailored to the market that you're expecting. So no, thank you for that. I have another question from Fergus McAteer. If you aren't in control of the requirements of your product, such as when working for a client, how should QA encourage inclusive development on such projects? Is it a question that an agency needs to market the benefits of accessible development to a potential client at the sales stage? I think it's a good one. How do we influence as QA or as testers on making inclusive design happen around us?
Sure. So it is a good question. For me, realistically, as an agency, you're being engaged for your expertise. Clients don't come to you because you don't know what you're doing. The reason why they go to a digital agency is because they've got a track record and they can show exactly what they can do. For me, it should be within the cost of the sales anyway. If we embed it in the start and we bring it through the client's requirements, it'll be the way we build it. It'll be the way we design it. We are there to guide the client. It shouldn't really be the tail wagging the dog, so to speak. The client's input will always be greatly valued because it's their problem that we're trying to solve. But realistically, as an agency, we are being brought in for our consultant because we are consulting for them. And if we, as part of our process, when we're selling it, as part of our process, these things are built in, it shouldn't really matter. The way that sort of comes across a little bit as if it would be an afterthought. So it's like the client's already bought into us and we're then having to try and sell them accessibility. Realistically, that should be within your sales pitch already, and not as an additional cost, just as a standard. This is how we do it.
Absolutely. That's a great input there. Thank you, Paul. Just because we've kind of ventured into the whole idea of testers and what we do around accessibility, I wanted to know from you, what are your recommended set of skills that one needs to kind of definitely include in their training to make sure they're prepared to do accessibility testing? Is there any recommendations you could give?
Yep, there's a really good book called Mismatches. It's written by, and the name is escaping me, it's Kat something, and I don't have the book to hand to get it. But she helped write the inclusive design toolkit at Microsoft. That is also a very good thing to read, is the inclusive toolkit. But if I'm being honest, the best thing to do is to go on places like Twitter and look at things like AXS chat and look at other hashtags and learn from people's experiences. Look at what people are talking about there. You'll get a wealth of knowledge there. Now, some of it, some people will talk for the sake of talking, but there is a lot of really good stuff out there. And there's loads of really good resources. If you expand what you're looking at into things like UX guidelines and things like that, that can then put your mindset right for when you're trying to do your testing. We're talking about dispelling sort of the reliance, the sole reliance on checklists and things like that. Those are fairly easy to get hold of. If you look for them, you can get checklists, you can get scripts and things like that. That'll help guide as a baseline. But if you're wanting to bring in more of that inclusive thought and looking at it from a person's point of view, that's where you need to go. You need to go and listen and look at people's actual experiences.
Thank you, Paul. Hope you don't mind. I have a further question around how I think automated accessibility tools are often, perceived as the kind of end of it all. And this kind of frustrates me a little bit. So a lot of claims to say, we have done accessibility testing, we have taken care of it, it's all done. And what you dig deeper and you see, all you see is the tool that's been added into the pipeline that will run some automated checks, and that's that. What's your take? I kind of feel it's a bit of a Misunderstood idea,
rolls up
automated
the sleeve
accessibility
slightly for this one. For me, they have their use. They are really good at highlighting what's in place and what's not in place. What they will not do for you, and for me, this immediately undermines it as turning around and saying that this has fixed it, is that yeah, it will identify that there's an alt tag, but it can't verify the context. It won't tell you that it's appropriate. You know, it's like it's just looking for markup. It's not going to tell you that that's actually appropriate to what's in front of you. So like as one example of why it doesn't really work, it throws a whole load of false positives. Sometimes it'll throw false negatives. You have to then sit and analyze the output of that. So they are useful. They are really useful. But without that organic part in front of the computer to actually go through it and see what's contextually correct and what's, you know, what is a real issue and what's not, they're kind of a bit redundant. They don't, you know, it's fine, you know, developers might run it and stuff like that, but realistically, we're not doing a full job if we just rely on those. It's not, they are fit for their purpose, but not for ours, would be the way I would describe it.
Yeah, I think it's very much an extension of the testing and checking discussion, in the sense that the automated tools are doing the checking, and as you say, useful, they have their place. But I do like your description of us as the organic factor. Yeah, that's what we are. We're testers, and taking that extension, we will spot things in a different way to the automated processes.
Thank you, Paul. So no, absolutely, fully agree. And yeah, so you're right. I think in so many levels, this is the point where we as a kind of practice have come to have almost been pushed to that point where we are compelled to think automating something will address everything. It's at this point still perhaps it's wishful thinking. I mean, unless we have machine learning and artificial intelligence come up and become kind of something that matches human cognition and ability to identify these issues. Really, I don't see how that replacement can happen. And this is where I feel that bit of awareness raising is important to say. Accessibility testing, yes, it's been done, cannot be done just by using automated tools. That would be an incorrect statement. So no, thank you both. And I guess there's one more question that's come up on the Q&A panel, and it's from Ravikala. And Ravikala Krishnan asks, could you please name any open source accessibility testing tools to explore for startup companies which are very tight on budget and would like to consider accessibility requirements are met?
Sure. So the tools I've mentioned today are all free. So Wave, that is a free tool that you can get Chrome extensions for and things like that. You can use that. There is, it's not great. You do have to validate it, but Lighthouse and DevTools, you can run an audit using that, and that will pull through what's there, what's not. Mentioned Silktide earlier. Silktide is a tool that you can get a Chrome extension from them for free that simulates disabilities. So it can give there's loads of different personas built in within that can allow you to sort of see if you can use your product using that persona setup and things like that. The government actually have a set of Google personas that I believe work really well on Chromebooks. They can work through the Chrome browser, but they're really good on Chromebooks specifically, where they've got computer setups for various different people with disabilities. And what you can do is you can use them to then test your products through the browser. And as Iris rightfully points out there, MVDA is a free screen reader tool that you can use. It's quite broadly used because it is free. You can get paid for ones with JAWS and all that sort of lot, but realistically, if it works on NVDA, it's going to work on the other ones. So yeah, there's loads and loads of them. I do have an expanded version of this presentation that has a list of things that you might be interested in terms of links for tools and for guides on how to write copy and stuff like that. So when I've said to David that we'll maybe get that distributed after the talk. So on the final slide, yeah, there's loads of little links and things like that for that sort of thing.
Thanks very much, Paul. I think that'll be much appreciated by the audience. I think some of those practical tips on around tools and how it can be done might be very helpful. One final question from me, if you don't mind. The one aspect about accessibility testing that might be a bit challenging is things like screen reader and how it needs a bit of acclimatization. What would your advice be for somebody who's preparing to do accessibility testing? How best to prepare for carrying out accessibility testing?
Practice, realistically. Practice. Things like the BBC website and things like that all conform to a very good standard of accessibility. They're built with that in mind. Try going around things like that with a screen reader. Don't look at your screen when you're doing it. That's another thing. Don't look at a screen when you're trying to do that. I know I was saying earlier on that, you know, using a blindfold and jumping on a screen reader is not going to give you the insight of somebody with disabilities, and that's true. But if you're wanting to learn how to use a screen reader properly, nothing forces you to do it more than if you can't actually see it. Because if you can see it, then that biases your interpretation of what you're working on. One eye-opening thing I had around screen readers was when I was on a plane. I was sitting on a plane. I'd been down to Bristol visiting a client, and there was a blind gentleman a couple of rows ahead of me on this tiny little plane with little propellers. It was a bit of a scary experience, but he had his mobile, but he didn't have any headphones, and he was trying to put it into airplane mode. And whenever prior to that point, anytime I'd ever done testing with a mobile phone, I'm sitting there looking at it, you know, swiping through, going to the different elements and stuff like that. Hadn't really thought about it, but this guy's sitting with the speaker next to his ear, and he's almost playing it like a harp, you know. And it was just one of those moments where, you know, it was just a light bulb moment where I went, oh, yeah. You know, it just seems strange that you wouldn't have it in front of you. So I would say practice. There will be sort of articles out there. If you Google them, you'll find articles on how to use screen readers and stuff like that. But for me, it's about finding something that you can practice with, get used to the short keys, and as I say, try where you can to sort of not look at the screen when you're using screen readers and stuff like that. And that should hopefully help you with your familiarity when it comes to testing things that maybe aren't as good as some of the sites that you would look at when you're practicing.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Paul. I think I've kind of exhausted my questions at this point, but really all of it has been so amazing, so informative, and I can tell the audience has gained a lot from this session. I'll now perhaps hand over to David. I think he had some important things to share, so I'll let him take over.
Yes, thank you very much, Paul. Again, that was absolutely brilliant and great to see so many people on. We had a record number on at one time for our webinar, so we up to 40 tonight, which surpasses the previous record of 38. So well done, and really good session and lots of interaction with the panelists, and the Q&A function was well used, which is great. So yeah, just wanted to do a couple of things to finish this off. So I've put a link in the chat, just a couple of comments up from the most current comment. And this is about our next event, which is on quality engineering instead of testing, and the why and the how. So we are delighted to announce that Rick Marcellus, very experienced practitioner in testing and software development, who also was the program chair at last year's Eurostar testing conference, has agreed to join us to give this presentation. I think it's going to be a really good one, and it does follow on from our actual DevOps series at the tail end of last year. There's a couple of good things in addition to this being a very good talk that I would like to point out here. The first one is that this is going to be quite an interactive session. So we're going to present some ideas and then ask the audience to select where we want to go next. So you'll be very much part of the journey through this presentation, and we'll have a tool that will help us to be able to do that kind of voting system. And the other thing that's going to be really good about it is Rick is very kindly, he's an author of a number of books, but his most recent book, Quality for DevOps Teams, is up for grabs. So we'll have 3 ebook copies to be able to give away. So we'll do some sort of virtual prize draw, tombola type experience in amongst this as well. So it's going to be a really positive and interactive session, and you'll get to learn quite a lot about this new trend of quality engineering instead of testing, as well as how you can make your DevOps team or your agile team more effective with better quality. So that's going to be a really good event. Please do sign up. It's the 24th of February at 6 p.m. UK time, and we'll hope you see you there. A couple of other things just to finish us off for the evening. So if you have an idea that you want to share with us, or you want to just get in touch and just do something with the Scottish Testing Group, whether it be a quick talk of 5-10 minutes, or whether it's 20 minutes or an hour, but it's something like tonight, just please do get in touch. We've now got a group email box, which is info@scottishtesting.org. So we'd love to hear from you if you've got any ideas and things you'd like to hear next. If you've got any ideas on how you would like to present at the group, just please get in touch and we'll look to get something set up for you, and we'll look to try our best to meet your needs, whatever they may be. And some of the next steps actually, so we ran a survey last summer, and that was really the springboard for starting these virtual events at the tail end of the year. So we'll look to do another one shortly, just to get some feedback on how we take the group forward, what you'd like to hear more about, and that kind of thing. We are working very much, this is an important point actually, we're working very much in partnership with other communities within Scotland. So we're working closely with the likes of the Ministry of Testing, Glasgow and Edinburgh. So what we're really trying to do is to bring you, the community members of Scotland and across Europe and the UK as well, if you are attending from those regions. It's just the best possible experience, the complementary experience that will meet your needs. We are also considering if it will be feasible to do some sort of hybrid or in-person events in Glasgow and Edinburgh. It doesn't seem like that is on the horizon immediately, but you never know. Things may start to improve to some extent as we get further through the year. Excited to note that the website launch is going to be coming soon. We had an old website and we have now got a new one, which we're in the process of developing and getting ready to be unveiled. So that should be there over the next week or two, and certainly we can talk about that at the next event. It'd be good to unveil it formally. And finally, we're looking for sponsors in 2021. So if you do have any ideas for organizations that would like to sponsor us, or any leads that you want to share with us, please just let us know by either the email address info@scottishtesting.org, or you can contact us on @scottishtesting on Twitter, or you can look us up on LinkedIn. Myself, Soumya and Sue would be happy to help with any suggestions or inquiries you might have. And finally, just a massive thank you to Paul for that wonderful presentation. Soumya, as always, for the guest hosting. I suppose you should just really be the host now, rather than the guest host, because you've become so good at it. And yes, we hope to see you all soon, and have a great evening. Thank you very much for joining. Bye-bye now, and good night.
Thanks very much. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye now.